My name is Rodrigo Vasquez, and I'm a UPS delivery driver who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak in Phoenix, Arizona. When contaminated water turned my customers into flesh-eating monsters, I had to choose between saving a group of strangers or finding my girlfriend Elena trapped across the infected city. Every decision meant life or death, and I wasn't prepared for any of it. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section. Below, perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Rodrigo Vasquez, but everyone calls me Roddy. I've been driving the same UPS delivery route through Phoenix, Arizona for 12 years. 12 years of the same streets, the same faces, the same routine. I knew every pothole on Baseline Road, every speed bump in the Ahwatukee suburbs, and every dog that would bark when I pulled up to their house. I delivered to over 300 addresses every week, and I thought I knew these people completely. Mrs. Martinez always waited on her porch at exactly 10:47 in the morning with her little chihuahua, Pepito. She'd wave and ask about my girlfriend Elena, then hand me a homemade tamale wrapped in foil. Mr. Chen would answer his door in his bathrobe, hair sticking up in every direction, apologizing for not being dressed while signing for his weekly shipment of car parts. The Johnsons had this massive German shepherd named Rex who would bark twice, then immediately start wagging his tail so hard his whole body wiggled. These weren't just customers to me. They were neighbors, friends, part of my daily routine that made Phoenix feel like a small town instead of a sprawling desert city. I thought I knew my world completely. I was wrong about everything, especially the faces. October 15th, 2024 started like any other Tuesday. My alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning, same as it had for over 4,000 days. Elena was still asleep next to me, her dark hair spread across the pillow, and I remember thinking how lucky I was that she put up with my early schedule. I'd been saving money for months to buy her an engagement ring, and I was planning to propose on her birthday next month. Life felt predictable, safe, normal. I made my usual cup of coffee, black with 2 sugars, and checked the weather on my phone. October in Phoenix meant the brutal summer heat was finally breaking, but it was still going to hit 95 degrees by afternoon. Perfect delivery weather, honestly. Not too hot, not too cold, just right for spending 10 hours in and out of a truck. The drive to the UPS depot took exactly 18 minutes, same route I'd taken every morning for 12 years. I knew every traffic light timing, every merge lane, every shortcut that could save me 30 seconds if I was running late. But I was never running late. Punctuality was everything in this job, and I took pride in being the guy who always showed up on time. When I pulled into the depot parking lot at 6:45, something felt different. There were fewer trucks than usual, which was strange for a Tuesday. Tuesdays were always busy because of Monday's backlog. I counted at least 6 empty spaces where delivery trucks should have been parked. That meant 6 drivers hadn't shown up for work, which almost never happened. Inside the building, the atmosphere was subdued. Usually, the morning shift was full of jokes and complaints about Monday night football or weekend plans gone wrong. But today, everyone seemed quieter, more focused on their sorting tasks. I grabbed my scanner and headed to the break room to get my route manifest. That's when I noticed the water fountain. I'd used that same fountain every morning for 12 years, and the water always tasted clean and cold. But when I took a sip, that Tuesday morning it had this weird metallic taste, almost like I was drinking liquid pennies. I made a face and spat it out, figuring maybe they were doing maintenance on the pipes or something. Phoenix water wasn't great to begin with, so a little off taste didn't seem like a big deal. Jenkins from the loading dock wasn't there. Harold Jenkins had worked at that depot for 23 years and had never called in sick on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were his favorite day because that's when we got the big shipments from California, and Jenkins loved organizing the chaos of hundreds of packages. But his station was empty, and when I asked Pete about it, he just shrugged and said, Jenkins called in with some kind of stomach bug. A stomach bug. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to that detail. My route that day included 137 stops spread across South Phoenix, from the fancy neighborhoods near South Mountain to the apartment complexes off Baseline Road. I loaded my truck with the usual mix of Amazon packages, medical, supplies for the elderly folks, and car parts for the mechanics. Everything seemed normal, routine, predictable. But predictable was about to become a word I'd never use again. My first stop was Mrs. Patterson's house on Desert Foothills Drive. She was an 80-year-old retired teacher who always had 3 newspapers, delivered to her front porch every morning: the Arizona Republic, the East Valley Tribune, and USA Today. She was obsessive about bringing them inside before 8 o'clock because she didn't want them to get sun-bleached. But when I pulled up to deliver her package at 7:23, all 3 newspapers were still sitting on her porch, along with Monday's papers underneath them. I knocked on her door for a full minute, but there was no answer. Mrs. Patterson was always home, always eager to chat about her grandchildren in California or complain about the heat. Her car was in the driveway and I could hear her television playing inside, but she never came to the door. I left her package between the screen door and the main door, same as always, but something felt wrong. The next stop was the Riverside, apartments on Warner Road. It was a complex I'd been delivering to for years and I knew most of the residents by name. But when I walked into the main hallway with my stack of packages, the smell hit me immediately. It was this sweet, coppery smell that reminded me of the butcher shop my dad used to take me to when I was a kid. But stronger, more concentrated, like someone had spilled a gallon of raw meat and left it to rot in the Arizona heat. The apartment manager, Lisa, usually greeted me in the lobby with her usual complaints about residents who didn't pick up their packages fast enough. But the lobby was empty, and that smell was getting stronger the deeper I went into the building. I delivered the packages to their designated spots and got out of there as fast as I could, telling myself it was probably just someone cooking something weird for breakfast. But my hands were shaking when I got back to my truck, and I couldn't explain why. The third stop was where things started to get really strange. I had a delivery for apartment 212, a guy named Marcus who worked night security at one of the casinos. He usually answered his door in his uniform, getting ready for his shift. But when he opened the door that morning, he looked terrible. His skin was pale and sweaty, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had this weird twitchy movement like he couldn't stand still. When I handed him the package, he grabbed my wrist instead of taking it from my hands. His grip was ice cold and surprisingly strong, and for a second, I thought he was going to pull me into his apartment. He was staring at me with this intense, hungry look that made every instinct in my body scream that something was very wrong. I yanked my arm back and practically threw the package at him, then got out of there as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I watched him standing in his doorway, still staring at my truck as I drove away. He didn't move to pick up the package that had fallen at his feet. He just stood there watching me leave with that same hungry expression. My radio had been playing classic rock all morning, but around 9:30 the DJ started talking about some kind of civil disturbances downtown. He was being vague about it, just mentioning that people should avoid the downtown area if possible, and that Phoenix police were responding to multiple incidents. I figured it was probably protesters or maybe some kind of gang activity. Downtown, Phoenix always had something going on, and it was nowhere near my delivery route. But then the reports started getting more frequent. Every few minutes there would be another traffic update about road closures, another warning about avoiding certain areas. The list of closed streets kept growing, and I started to recognize some of them. These weren't just downtown streets. They were spreading out into the residential areas, getting closer to my route. I tried calling Elena during my lunch break to see if she'd heard anything about what was happening, but her phone went straight to voicemail. That wasn't unusual since she was teaching her 4th grade class and always kept her phone on silent during school hours. But I left her a message anyway, telling her I loved her and asking her to call me back when she got a chance. I wish I'd driven straight to her school right then. I wish I'd forgotten about the rest of my deliveries and just gone to pick her up. But I didn't. I was being responsible, professional, doing my job like I always did. The packages had to be delivered, and people were counting on me. The afternoon deliveries started normally enough. I dropped off medication at the senior living facility on Ray Road, delivered art supplies to the high school, left a stack of legal documents at the law office near the mall. But I kept noticing little things that seemed off. There were more car accidents than usual. I passed 3 fender benders in the span of an hour, which was weird for a Tuesday afternoon. Traffic lights were malfunctioning at several intersections. A few businesses that should have been open had their doors locked and their closed signs up. And the people I did see were acting strangely. There was this woman at the gas station who was filling up her tank while talking to herself, gesturing wildly at nothing. A man walking his dog kept looking over his shoulder like someone was following him, even though the street was empty. Little things, but when you drive the same route every day for 12 years, you notice when the rhythm is off. By 3 o'clock, I was running ahead of schedule, which almost never happened. Usually, I'd spend a few extra minutes chatting with customers or helping elderly residents carry their packages inside. But today, people seemed to want to get their deliveries and close their doors as quickly as possible. The normal friendly interactions I was used to were replaced by quick thanks and immediate door closing. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any kids outside all day. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, perfect weather for playing in the parks or riding bikes in the neighborhoods. But every playground I passed was empty. Every park was deserted. Even the high school seemed unusually quiet for the time of day when students should have been getting out of classes. I had 17 stops left on my route when I pulled up to Mrs. Martinez's house on Desert Hills Drive. For 12 years, she had been waiting on her front porch at exactly 10:47 in the morning. Not 10:45, not 10:50. 10:47. She'd wave from her rocking chair, ask about Elena, hand me a tamale, and tell me to have a blessed day. It was the most reliable part of my entire route. But when I arrived at 3:27 in the afternoon, her porch was empty. Pepito was barking from inside the house, which was strange because he was usually the most well-behaved dog I'd ever met. The barking was frantic, desperate, not his usual happy yapping when he saw my truck. Mrs. Martinez's front door was slightly ajar, which was completely out of character for her. She was obsessive about home security, always kept her doors locked, always checked them twice before going to bed. There were dark stains on the white stucco wall next to her front door. At first glance, they looked like mud or maybe spilled paint. But the more I stared at them, the more they looked like something else entirely. Something that made my stomach turn and my hands start shaking again. I sat in my truck for a full minute, trying to decide what to do. Mrs. Martinez was 73 years old and lived alone except for Pepito. If something had happened to her, if she'd fallen or had a medical emergency, she might need help. But every instinct in my body was telling me to drive away, to finish my route, to pretend I hadn't noticed anything unusual. Finally, I grabbed my scanner and got out of the truck. I figured I'd just knock on the door, make sure she was okay, and then continue with my deliveries. Just being a good neighbor, nothing more. The closer I got to her front door, the stronger that copper smell became. The same smell I'd noticed at the apartment complex that morning, but concentrated, overwhelming. Pepito's barking was getting more frantic, and I could hear him scratching at what sounded like a door inside the house. I knocked on the front door and called out, "Mrs. Martinez, it's Roddy from UPS. I have a package for you." But there was no answer, just Pepito's continued barking and what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor inside. That's when my phone rang. Elena's ringtone, the one I'd programmed to play La Bamba because it always made her laugh. I answered it immediately, grateful for the distraction. But it wasn't Elena's voice on the other end. It was her voicemail greeting, and I realized I was hearing her voice coming from my phone's speaker because I'd accidentally called her number instead of her calling me. My hands were shaking so badly that I'd hit the wrong button. I hung up and immediately called her back. But this time it went straight to voicemail after one ring. That meant her phone was either dead or turned off, which was unusual for the middle of a school day. I left another message trying to keep my voice calm and normal, asking her to call me back as soon as possible. As I was ending the call, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was Elena's voice, but it was coming from inside Mrs. Martinez's house. For a split second, I thought maybe Elena was visiting her. Maybe she'd stopped by after school to check on the elderly woman, like she sometimes did, but then I realized what I was actually hearing. It was Elena's voice, but it was coming from a television or radio inside the house. And it wasn't Elena talking. It was a news report, and Elena was being interviewed as a teacher about some kind of emergency at her school. I pressed my ear against the door and listened. Elena's voice was shaky, scared, nothing like her usual confident teacher tone. She was saying something about students being sent home early, about parents being called to pick up their children immediately, about something being wrong, but she didn't know what. That's when the emergency broadcast signal cut in, that harsh, attention-grabbing tone that makes your skin crawl. I'd heard it before during flash flood warnings or dust storms, but this was different. The voice that came after the tone was urgent, almost panicked. This is an emergency broadcast from the Maricopa County Emergency Management Office. Residents are advised to avoid consuming tap water until further notice. Multiple reports of water contamination have been confirmed. Throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area, citizens experiencing symptoms of nausea, fever, or aggressive behavior should seek immediate medical attention. Avoid contact with individuals displaying erratic or violent behavior. This is not a test. Repeat, this is not a test. The broadcast continued, but I could barely process what I was hearing. Water contamination, aggressive behavior, violent individuals. And I thought about the metallic taste in the water fountain that morning, about Jenkins calling in sick, about the 3 missing delivery drivers, about Marcus grabbing my wrist with that hungry look in his eyes. I heard movement inside Mrs. Martinez's house, something shuffling across the floor toward the front door. Pepito's barking suddenly stopped, replaced by a whimpering sound that broke my heart. And then I heard Mrs. Martinez's voice. But it wasn't right. It was her voice, but the words were wrong, slurred like she was talking through a mouthful of cotton. She was saying my name, Roddy, Roddy, but it sounded like she was gargling while she spoke. The front door started to open wider, and I stepped back instinctively. Mrs. Martinez appeared in the doorway, but she wasn't the same woman who had been handing me tamales and asking about Elena for the past 12 years. Her skin was gray, the color of old concrete. Her eyes were cloudy and unfocused, staring past me rather than at me. Her mouth was open, and there was something dark and thick dripping from her lips down onto her favorite floral dress. The dress she wore to church every Sunday, the one she'd told me her late husband had bought for her 40 years ago. But the worst part was her movement. She was shuffling, dragging her feet like she couldn't quite remember how to walk properly. Her arms were hanging at her sides, but her fingers were twitching, grasping at nothing. And she was making this sound, this low moaning noise that definitely wasn't human. She took a step toward me, and that's when I saw Pepito. He was behind her in the hallway, but he wasn't moving. He was lying on his side in a pool of something dark, and his little body was completely still. Mrs. Martinez took another step toward me, and I realized she wasn't looking past me anymore. She was looking at me, and there was something in those cloudy eyes that was pure hunger. Not the hunger for food, but something else entirely. Something that wanted to consume me, to tear me apart, to make me like her. I backed away from the door, but she kept coming. Her movements were getting faster, more coordinated, like she was remembering how to use her body. And that moaning sound was getting louder, more insistent. I turned and ran back to my truck, fumbling with my keys as Mrs. Martinez shuffled after me. I could hear her feet dragging on the concrete driveway, and when I looked back, she was moving faster than should have been possible for a 73-year-old woman. I got the truck started and threw it in reverse, backing out of her driveway as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I watched Mrs. Martinez stumble into the street, following the sound of my engine. She was still making that horrible moaning noise, and even from a distance I could see the dark stains covering the front of her dress. But she wasn't alone anymore. There were other people coming out of houses along the street. They were all moving the same way. That shuffling, dragging gait. They were all making similar sounds, low moans and grunts that seemed to echo each other. And they were all heading toward my truck. I floored the accelerator and got out of that neighborhood as fast as I could, but I couldn't stop checking my mirrors. The people in the street didn't stop following me. They kept walking in the direction I'd gone even after my truck was long out of sight. That was 3 hours ago, and I still can't get the image of Mrs. Martinez out of my head. The woman who had been like a grandmother to me, who had worried about me during the summer heat and celebrated when I told her about Elena. She was gone, replaced by something else entirely, something that wanted to hurt me. I drove around Phoenix for another hour, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, trying to convince myself that I'd misunderstood the situation. Maybe Mrs. Martinez was sick, maybe she was having some kind of medical episode, maybe the water contamination was causing hallucinations or seizures or something that could be treated. But everywhere I went, I saw more signs that something was terribly wrong. There were more accidents, more emergency vehicles, more people acting strangely. The radio reports were getting more frequent and more urgent. Road closures were expanding throughout the city, and I started seeing other people like Mrs. Martinez, people who moved wrong and looked wrong and sounded wrong. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of going home, instead of trying to reach Elena's school, I drove to the Fry's food store on Ray Road and looked for other people who seemed normal, who seemed scared and confused like I was. I found them. 12 other people who had seen what I'd seen, who had heard the emergency broadcasts, who understood that Phoenix was falling apart around us. We barricaded ourselves inside the grocery store, thinking we'd wait for help to arrive, thinking this was temporary. We had no idea that we were about to learn the true meaning of survival, or that the woman I loved was trapped somewhere in this nightmare city, probably wondering where I was and why I hadn't come to find her. The first thing I did after leaving Mrs. Martinez's house was try to call Elena again. My hands were still shaking from what I'd just seen, and I could barely hold the phone steady enough to dial her number. It went straight to voicemail again, but this time I didn't leave a message. I just hung up and tried to think clearly about what to do next. Roosevelt Elementary was only 4 miles from where I was, but those 4 miles might as well have been 400. The emergency broadcast was still playing on repeat, warning people to avoid tap water and stay away from individuals displaying violent behavior, but it wasn't giving us any real information about what was happening or how to stay safe. I decided to drive toward Elena's school, but I took the back roads instead of my usual route. Something told me to avoid the main streets, to stay away from areas where there might be crowds of people. I'd seen enough in the past few hours to know that people weren't acting normally, and I didn't want to run into more situations like the one with Mrs. Martinez. The first thing I noticed as I drove through the residential neighborhoods was how quiet everything was. It was 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. There should have been kids getting off school buses, parents picking up children from daycare, people walking their dogs or checking their mail. But the streets were empty except for the occasional abandoned car or person walking alone with that same shuffling gait I'd seen from Mrs. Martinez. I passed 3 car accidents in the span of 2 miles. Not fender benders or minor collisions, but serious crashes where cars had slammed into trees or light poles or other vehicles at high speed. None of them had emergency responders on scene, which was strange because Phoenix Fire Department was usually pretty quick to respond to accidents. At one of the crash sites, I could see someone moving around inside one of the damaged cars. They were trapped behind a deployed airbag, but instead of calling for help or trying to get out, they were just thrashing around randomly, making movements that didn't seem purposeful or coordinated. I slowed down to see if I could help, but when I got closer, I realized the person wasn't trying to escape. They were trying to get to me. The driver had somehow gotten their head and one arm free from the wreckage, and they were reaching toward my truck with the same desperate, hungry expression I'd seen on Mrs. Martinez's face. Their mouth was opening and closing like they were trying to bite the air, and there was that same dark substance dripping from their lips. I drove away from that accident scene as fast as I could, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. These people weren't just sick or confused. They were something else entirely, something that wanted to hurt other people in ways I didn't want to imagine. My phone rang while I was stopped at a traffic light, and for a second my heart jumped because I thought it might be Elena. But it was my supervisor, Mike, calling from the UPS depot. "Roddy, where are you?" Mike's voice sounded strained, panicked. "We've got drivers not responding to radio calls, trucks abandoned in the middle of routes, and I've got corporate breathing down my neck wanting to know what's happening." I told him about Mrs. Martinez and the emergency broadcasts, about the water contamination warnings and the strange behavior I'd been seeing all day. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Jesus, Roddy," Mike finally said. I think you need to get somewhere safe and stay there. Jenkins showed up to work this morning, but he attacked 2 people in the loading dock before we could stop him. We had to call the police, but they never showed up. Half my drivers are missing, and the other half are reporting the same kind of stuff you're talking about. He told me that the company was suspending all deliveries until further notice, and that employees should go home and wait for instructions. But going home was the last thing I wanted to do. Elena wasn't at home. She was at Roosevelt Elementary, and I needed to get to her. I was about 2 miles from the school when I hit the first roadblock. It wasn't an official police barricade, just a bunch of abandoned cars clustered together in the middle of the intersection, like someone had tried to create a barrier. I had to back up and find an alternate route, using side streets and residential, roads I'd learned during my years of delivery driving. That's when I started seeing them in larger groups. The people who moved wrong, who looked wrong, who made those horrible moaning sounds. They were gathering in the streets, not doing anything specific, just standing around or walking aimlessly. But whenever they heard my truck engine, they would turn toward the sound and start moving in my direction. I realized I was going to have to abandon my truck if I wanted to get any closer to Elena's school. The engine noise was attracting too much attention and the roads were becoming impassable anyway. But before I could make that decision, I saw something that changed everything. There was a group of people barricaded inside the Fry's food store, on Ray Road. I could see them through the windows moving around inside the store, and they were moving normally. Not that shuffling, dragging gait I'd been seeing all afternoon, but regular human movement. They had pushed shopping carts against the doors and windows, creating makeshift barriers, and one of them was standing near the entrance holding what looked like a baseball bat. I parked my truck in the loading dock behind the store and approached the back entrance carefully. I didn't want to scare them, but I also didn't want to get attacked if they thought I was one of the infected people. I knocked on the back door and called out, "I'm not sick, I'm just looking for somewhere safe to wait this out." After a few minutes, I heard voices on the other side of the door, people arguing about whether or not to let me in. Finally, the door opened, and I found myself face to face with a woman in scrubs who was obviously a nurse or medical worker. She looked me up and down carefully, checking my eyes, my skin, my general behavior. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "Any bites, scratches, or cuts?" I told her no, and she let me inside. That's how I met Sarah, who turned out to be an emergency room nurse at Banner Desert Medical Center. She'd been at the grocery store when things started going wrong, and she'd helped organize the other survivors into a defensive position. There were 12 of us total. Besides Sarah and myself, there was Tom, a retired Phoenix police sergeant who'd been shopping for his wife when the emergency broadcasts started. Miguel was a mechanic who'd been buying lunch when he saw people attacking each other in the parking lot. There was an elderly couple, Frank and Dorothy, who'd been married for 53 years and refused to be separated even in an emergency like this. The others were a mix of people who'd been in the wrong place at the right time. Lisa, a high school teacher. James, a construction worker. Maria, a single mother with 2 kids who were thankfully at their father's house. Kevin, a college student. Amanda, a bank teller. And Robert, a firefighter who'd been off duty when everything started. We spent the first hour sharing our stories, trying to piece together what was happening. Everyone had seen similar things. People acting aggressively, water tasting strange, emergency broadcasts warning about contamination. Sarah, with her medical background, was the first to suggest that we were dealing with some kind of infectious disease. "The symptoms are consistent with a neurological infection," she explained. "Something that affects brain function and increases aggressive behavior. The water contamination could be the vector, which would explain why it's spreading so fast." Tom nodded grimly. "I've seen riots and civil unrest, but this is different. These people aren't angry or upset about something. They're like animals, pure predator instinct." Miguel had been looking out the windows while we talked, and he reported that the number of infected people outside was growing. "They're not just wandering around anymore," he said. "They're gathering like they're drawn to this place." That's when I realized we might have made a mistake by barricading ourselves inside the store. We were trapped, with limited supplies and no way to escape if the situation got worse. But we were also safer than we would have been on the streets, and we had each other for support and protection. I told them about Elena, about my need to get to Roosevelt Elementary to find her. Tom shook his head immediately. "Son, I understand you want to find your girlfriend, but going out there alone is suicide," he said. "These things are attracted to noise and movement. The more you try to run from them, the more attention you'll draw." Sarah agreed. "We need to wait for official help to arrive. The National Guard, FEMA, somebody with the resources to handle this situation properly. But I couldn't just sit there and wait while Elena was trapped somewhere in the city, probably scared and wondering where I was. I'd promised her I'd always be there for her, and I wasn't going to break that promise now." The radio in the store was still working, and we kept it tuned to the emergency broadcast station. The reports were getting worse by the hour. Water treatment facilities throughout the Phoenix area were shutting down. Hospitals were overwhelmed with violent patients. Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport was closed. Interstate highways leading out of the city were blocked by abandoned vehicles and crowds of infected people. But the most disturbing report came around 6 o'clock in the evening. The emergency broadcast announced that Roosevelt Elementary, along with several other schools in the district, had been evacuated to emergency shelters. Students and staff were being relocated to Chase Field, the baseball stadium downtown, which had been converted into a refugee center. Elena might be alive. She might be safe. But she was 20 miles away, across a city that was falling apart, surrounded by thousands of people who wanted to kill anyone who wasn't already infected. As night fell, the situation outside the store got worse. We could hear them now, the infected people making those horrible moaning sounds as they moved around in the parking lot. Tom had turned off all the lights inside the store so we wouldn't attract attention, but we could still see their silhouettes moving past the windows. Miguel counted at least 30 of them in the immediate area, and more were arriving every hour. They seemed to be drawn to the store for some reason. Maybe because they could sense we were inside, or maybe just because it was a large building that provided shelter. "We're going to have to make some hard decisions," Tom said quietly. "We can't stay here indefinitely. We've got food and water for maybe 3 days if we're careful, but those things outside aren't going anywhere." Sarah had been checking our medical supplies, and her report wasn't encouraging. "I've got basic first aid supplies from the pharmacy section, but nothing for serious injuries. If someone gets hurt, or if someone gets bitten, I don't have the resources to help them." That's when the reality of our situation really hit me. We weren't just waiting for help to arrive. We were fighting for our lives, and every decision we made could mean the difference between survival and becoming one of those things outside. I volunteered to take the first watch, partly because I couldn't sleep and partly because I needed time to think about how to get to Elena. I positioned myself near the front windows where I could see the parking lot and the street beyond. Some infected people moved differently at night. During the day, they'd been wandering aimlessly, but now they seemed more focused, more purposeful. They were gathering in groups, and those groups were moving together like packs of animals. I watched one group of about 15 infected people follow a stray cat across the parking lot, surrounding it and killing it within seconds. But the most disturbing thing I saw that night was how they communicated with each other. They didn't talk, but they made sounds, grunts, and moans that seemed to have meaning. When one of them found something interesting, like the cat, it would make a specific sound, and the others would respond and move toward it. They were learning, they were adapting, and they were getting smarter. Around midnight, we heard helicopters flying overhead, military helicopters, based on the sound. For a few minutes, everyone got excited, thinking that help was finally arriving. But the helicopters didn't land. They just flew in wide circles over the city, and we could see searchlights sweeping back and forth across the streets. Tom's police radio was still working, and we could hear fragments of transmissions from emergency responders. Most of it was code words and technical jargon, but the tone was clearly desperate. Police units requesting backup that wasn't available. Fire departments reporting that they couldn't reach certain areas of the city. Hospital emergency rooms declaring that they were no longer accepting patients. The government wasn't coming to save us. We were on our own. I spent the rest of my watch thinking about Elena, wondering if she was safe at Chase Field, wondering if she was thinking about me. We'd been together for 3 years, and I'd never spent a night away from her without at least talking on the phone. But now, I didn't even know if she was alive, and there was no way to contact her. When Sarah relieved me at 3 in the morning, I tried to get some sleep on a makeshift bed of shopping bags and towels. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Martinez's face, gray and lifeless, but still moving, still hungry for something I didn't want to understand. I must have dozed off for a few hours, because I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. It was dawn, and something had shattered one of the windows at the back of the store. Tom and Miguel were already investigating, and they motioned for the rest of us to stay quiet. One of the infected people had somehow gotten into the loading dock area and was trying to break through the back entrance. It was a man in a business suit, probably someone who'd been on his way to work when the infection hit him. But now his suit was torn and stained, his tie was hanging loose around his neck, and his face was that same gray color I'd seen on Mrs. Martinez. Miguel grabbed a crowbar from the hardware section and approached the back door carefully. The infected man was pounding on the door with his fists, making that horrible moaning sound, but he wasn't trying to break the door down systematically. He was just hitting it randomly, like he didn't understand what a door was or how it worked. But when Miguel got closer, the infected man suddenly stopped making noise and pressed his face against the window in the door. He was staring directly at Miguel, and his expression changed from mindless aggression to focused hunger. He could see Miguel, and he wanted to get to him. That's when we realized that the infected people weren't just mindless monsters. They could think, at least on a basic level. They could recognize living people as prey, and they could focus their attention on specific targets. Miguel backed away from the door, and the infected man went back to his random pounding. But now we knew that they were aware of us, that they could see us and track us if we got too close. "We need to get out of here," Tom said quietly. "If one of them found us, others will too. And if they can see us through the windows, it's only a matter of time before they figure out how to get inside." Sarah nodded in agreement. "The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it becomes. We need to find a more secure location, somewhere, with better defenses and multiple escape routes." But where could we go? The entire city was infected, and we had no idea which areas were safe or how far the contamination had spread. We were trapped in a grocery store surrounded by people who wanted to kill us, with limited supplies and no way to contact the outside world. That's when I made my decision. I was going to leave the group and try to reach Elena at Chase Field. I couldn't just sit there and wait while she was possibly alive and looking for me. I had to try to get to her, even if it meant going through 20 miles of infected city. I told the group about my plan, and they tried to talk me out of it. Tom said it was suicide. Sarah said I'd be more valuable to the group if I stayed and helped them survive. Miguel offered to come with me, which I appreciated but couldn't accept. These people needed him more than I did. But I'd made up my mind. I was going to find Elena, or I was going to die trying. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved her if I'd just been brave enough to try. I spent the morning preparing for the journey. I took a baseball bat from the sporting goods section, filled a backpack with water bottles and energy bars, and studied the route I'd need to take to get to Chase Field. I knew the streets well, from my delivery routes, but I'd never had to navigate them while avoiding crowds of infected people. The others helped me plan the route, identifying potential safe houses and escape routes along the way. Frank, the elderly man, gave me a small pocket knife that had belonged to his father. Dorothy insisted I take an extra jacket because the desert gets cold at night. Maria, the single mother, asked me to look for her children if I made it to the evacuation center. She gave me their names and descriptions, and I promised I'd find them if I could. James, the construction worker, showed me how to reinforce the baseball bat with duct tape to make it more effective as a weapon. But the hardest part was saying goodbye to people who'd become like family in less than 24 hours. We'd been through something terrible together, and we'd kept each other alive when the rest of the world was falling apart. Leaving them felt like abandoning my own family. Tom pulled me aside before I left and gave me his spare ammunition for the pistol he'd been carrying. "I know you're not trained with firearms," he said, "but if things get really bad, you might need this." Sarah checked my supplies one more time and made sure I understood the signs of infection to watch for in myself. "If you get bitten, "You've got maybe 6 hours before you turn," she said. "Don't try to be a hero. End it quickly before you become one of them." At 10 o'clock in the morning, exactly 24 hours after I'd seen Mrs. Martinez for the last time, I prepared to leave the safety of Fry's food store and venture into the infected city to find the woman I loved. I had no idea if Elena was still alive, if Chase Field was really a safe zone, or if I'd even make it 20 blocks before getting killed. But I knew I had to try. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least attempt to find her. The others watched from the windows as I made my way across the parking lot toward my truck. The infected people were still out there, maybe 40 or 50 of them now, but they were scattered across the area and not paying attention to the loading dock. I made it to my truck without being seen, but when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The battery was dead, probably from leaving the radio on all night. I was going to have to make the 20-mile journey to Chase Field on foot, through streets filled with people who wanted to kill me. As I shouldered my backpack and gripped the baseball bat, I took one last look at the grocery store where I'd spent the most terrifying and important 24 hours of my life. The people inside had become my family, and I was leaving them behind to search for the woman who might already be dead. But I had to try. Elena was out there somewhere, and I'd promised her I'd always find her. Even if it killed me, I was going to keep that promise. The first thing I learned about surviving on foot in an infected city is that everything you think you know about your neighborhood becomes useless. Streets I'd driven down thousands of times looked completely different when I was walking them. Trying to stay hidden, listening for the sounds that meant death was coming for me. My truck battery being dead was probably the best thing that could have happened, even though it didn't feel like it at the time. The engine noise would have drawn every infected person within a mile radius directly to me. On foot, I could move, quietly, duck into alleys when I heard that horrible moaning sound, and actually have a chance of reaching Chasefield alive. The first part of my journey took me through the residential neighborhoods south of the grocery store. These were areas I knew intimately from my delivery route, houses where I'd dropped off packages for families I'd gotten to know over the years. But now, those same houses looked like something out of a nightmare. Front doors hung open, revealing dark interiors where anything could be lurking. Cars sat abandoned in driveways with their doors open and their contents scattered across lawns. Children's toys were scattered in yards, but there were no children anywhere to be seen. The silence was the worst part. Phoenix was never this quiet, even in the early morning hours. I made it about 6 blocks before I encountered my first group of infected people. They were clustered around an overturned ice cream truck in the middle of Baseline Road, and at first I thought they were trying to get to the ice cream inside. But as I got closer, I realized they were feeding on something else entirely. Something that had been driving the truck when it crashed. I managed to slip past them by cutting through the backyard of a house I'd delivered to dozens of times. The Hendersons' place, where Mrs. Henderson always insisted on giving me homemade cookies and showing me pictures of her grandchildren. But their backyard gate was open, and when I looked through their kitchen window, I could see dark stains on the walls that told me the Hendersons weren't baking cookies anymore. The infected people at the ice cream truck didn't notice me, but I learned something important about their behavior. They were focused, almost obsessively so, when they were feeding. Once they found something to consume, they ignored everything else around them until they were finished. That information might save my life later. By the time I reached Indian School Road, about 3 miles from the grocery store, I started seeing signs of organized resistance. Someone had spray-painted Safe House on the side of a Circle K convenience store, with arrows pointing toward a strip mall across the street. There were barricades made of shopping carts and overturned cars, and I could see people moving around, inside the buildings. Part of me wanted to stop and join them, to find safety in numbers like I had at the grocery store. But I knew that every minute I delayed was another minute Elena had to wonder if I was coming for her. I had to keep moving, toward Chase Field, no matter how dangerous it was. I was crossing the parking lot of a defunct Blockbuster video when I heard someone calling my name. At first I thought I was hallucinating, that the stress and fear were making me hear things that weren't there. But when I turned around, I saw a man waving at me from the roof of a Taco Bell. It was Dave Martinez, Mrs. Martinez's nephew. I'd met him a few times when he visited his aunt, and he recognized me even from a distance. He was shouting for me to come up to the roof, that it was safe up there, that they had supplies and weapons. But I also saw why Dave was on the roof instead of at ground level. The Taco Bell was surrounded by infected people, at least 20 of them, all pressed against the building like they were trying to get inside. Dave and whoever else was up there were trapped, just like we'd been trapped at the grocery store. I wanted to help him, but I didn't have the resources or the time to mount a rescue operation. And deep down, I knew that getting involved would probably get all of us killed. So I waved back at Dave, pointed toward Chase Field to let him know where I was going, and kept moving. The guilt of leaving him behind ate at me for the next several miles. Dave was family to Mrs. Martinez, and Mrs. Martinez had been like family to me. But I'd learned at the grocery store that you can't save everyone, and trying to be a hero usually just gets more people killed. The closer I got to downtown Phoenix, the worse the situation became. What had been isolated groups of infected people in the residential areas became crowds, then herds, then something that looked like a migration. They were all moving in roughly the same direction, toward the center of the city, like they were being drawn by something I couldn't see or hear. I had to abandon my original route and start moving parallel to their migration pattern instead of cutting across it. This added miles to my journey, but it was better than trying to push through hundreds of infected people who would tear me apart the moment they noticed me. That's when I started using my knowledge of Phoenix's delivery infrastructure to my advantage. I'd spent 12 years learning every loading dock, every service entrance, every maintenance tunnel in the city. Normal people didn't know these routes existed, but delivery drivers lived in this hidden world of back alleys and service roads. I made it through the industrial district by following a series of loading docks behind shopping centers and office buildings. These areas were largely empty because most of the infected people had been drawn to the residential neighborhoods where there were more potential victims. But I still had to be careful because some of them had wandered into these areas and were lurking in doorways or behind dumpsters. It was in one of these service alleys that I found my first real weapon upgrade. Someone had abandoned a delivery truck, probably another UPS driver who'd realized the same thing I had about engine noise attracting attention. The back of the truck was full of packages, but more importantly, it contained a tire iron and a heavy-duty flashlight. I also found something else in that truck that made my blood run cold. The driver's manifest showed deliveries to Roosevelt Elementary School, medical supplies, the kind that schools keep in their nurses' offices. This driver had been heading to Elena's school when everything went wrong. I checked the cab of the truck and found the driver's logbook. His last entry was Tuesday morning at 9:37, about an hour before I'd encountered Mrs. Martinez. He'd written, "Weird stuff happening downtown, radio reports getting scary," and then nothing else. The truck was empty except for the packages and tools, which meant the driver had either escaped on foot or been killed somewhere nearby. As I continued toward downtown, I started seeing evidence of larger conflicts. Military vehicles abandoned on street corners, police cars with their windows smashed out, fires that had burned themselves out after consuming entire city blocks. The government response had been overwhelmed quickly, probably within the first few hours of the outbreak. But I also saw signs that some people were fighting back effectively, makeshift barriers constructed from cars and debris, areas where the infected people seemed to avoid, buildings with reinforced entrances and sniper positions on the roofs. Phoenix wasn't going down without a fight, even if that fight was being waged by ordinary citizens with improvised weapons. The sun was starting to set by the time I reached the outskirts of downtown, and I knew I was going to have to find shelter for the night. Moving through the city in darkness would be suicide, especially with the concentration of infected people I was seeing in the downtown area. I found temporary refuge in a parking garage attached to an office building. The lower levels were full of abandoned cars, but the upper levels were empty and provided good visibility of the surrounding streets. I could see Chase Field from the top level, maybe 2 miles away, but those 2 miles looked like they were crawling with infected people. From my vantage point in the parking garage, I could see the full scope of what had happened to Phoenix. Entire neighborhoods were dark without power or any signs of life. Fires burned unchecked in several areas, sending columns of smoke into the desert sky. The highways leading out of the city were clogged with abandoned vehicles, creating massive traffic jams that would probably never be cleared. But Chase Field was lit up like a beacon. Stadium lights illuminated the area around the baseball stadium, and I could see military vehicles and helicopter landing pads. There were people there. Living people. And Elena might be among them. I spent the night in that parking garage, taking short naps between periods of watching the streets below. The infected people were more active at night, moving in larger groups and making more noise. They seemed to be drawn to the stadium lights just like I was, but they were being kept away by some kind of perimeter defense I couldn't see from my position. Around midnight, I witnessed something that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. A group of about 30 infected people encountered a chain-link fence that was blocking their path toward the stadium. Instead of wandering around aimlessly like I'd expected, they began working together to tear down the fence. It wasn't coordinated in the way that living people would coordinate, but it wasn't random either. Some of them pulled on the fence posts, while others pushed against the chain link itself. They were problem-solving, adapting their behavior to overcome obstacles. The fence came down in less than 10 minutes. That's when I realized that the infected people weren't just mindless monsters, driven by hunger. They were evolving, learning from their environment and from each other. The longer this outbreak continued, the more dangerous they would become. I also noticed something else that night that would prove important later. The infected people moved differently depending on how long they'd been infected. The fresh ones, the people who had turned recently, still moved somewhat normally. But the older ones, the people who had been infected for days, moved with a different kind of coordination. They seemed to understand things that the newer ones didn't. Dawn brought new challenges and new opportunities. The infected people were less active during daylight hours, but there were more of them than there had been the night before. Phoenix's population was being converted steadily, and every person who got bitten became another threat to the remaining survivors. I left the parking garage early in the morning and began the final approach to Chase Field. This was the most dangerous part of my journey because the infected people were concentrated around the stadium, drawn by the lights and the activity. They could sense inside. I had to use every trick I'd learned about moving quietly and staying hidden. Storm drains provided cover for short distances. Loading docks and service alleys let me bypass the main streets where the infected people congregated. Construction sites offered temporary hiding spots and elevated positions where I could observe the situation ahead, but it was in one of those construction sites that I made my first serious mistake. I was crossing between two buildings when I knocked over a stack of metal pipes. The noise echoed through the construction zone like a dinner bell, and within seconds I could hear that horrible moaning sound coming from multiple directions. I ran. There was no other choice. Stealth and careful planning went out the window when 20 infected people started converging on my position from different angles. I jumped over barriers, dodged around equipment, and sprinted toward what I hoped was a way out of the construction zone. But running attracted more attention. Infected people who had been wandering aimlessly suddenly focused on me and started pursuing. The group of 20 became 40, then 60, then more than I could count. I was leading a parade of monsters through downtown Phoenix, and they were gaining on me. That's when I discovered something crucial about the infected people's limitations. They could run, but they couldn't run fast and they couldn't run for long periods. Their coordination was good enough for walking and basic problem solving, but sustained physical activity seemed to overwhelm their damaged nervous systems. I managed to stay ahead of them by using obstacles they couldn't navigate easily. Stairs, narrow passages, and areas that required jumping or climbing left most of them behind. But the ones who could follow me, the recently infected ones who still had most of their physical capabilities, were persistent and dangerous. I lost them by diving into a storm drain and crawling through a concrete tunnel that was too small for most adults to navigate comfortably. I spent 20 minutes in that tunnel, listening to them moaning and scratching at the entrance, before they finally gave up and wandered away. When I emerged from the storm drain, I was less than half a mile from Chase Field, but I was exhausted, dehydrated, and running low on the energy bars I'd taken from the grocery store. Worse, I'd lost my baseball bat somewhere during the chase, and my only remaining weapon was the pocket knife Frank had given me. But I could see the stadium now, and I could see the defensive perimeter that was keeping the infected people away from it. Military vehicles formed a barrier around the entire complex, with soldiers manning checkpoints and guard towers. There were helicopters landing and taking off regularly, bringing in supplies and evacuating people to safer locations. Elena was somewhere inside that perimeter. After 2 days of terror and uncertainty, I was finally close enough to find her and bring her to safety. But first, I had to get past the infected people surrounding the stadium and convince the military guards that I wasn't a threat. The final approach to Chase Field required everything I'd learned about the infected people's behavior patterns. They were drawn to noise and movement, but they were also creatures of habit. They followed the same routes repeatedly, like grooves worn into their damaged minds. I spent an hour observing their movement patterns, identifying gaps in their coverage, and timing my approach to avoid the largest groups. The military perimeter had spotlights that swept the area regularly, and I had to time my movements to stay in the dark zones between the light sweeps. When I finally made my move, everything went perfectly for about 50 yards. I slipped between two groups of infected people, stayed low to avoid the spotlights, and made it to within shouting distance of the military checkpoint. Then everything went wrong at once. One of the infected people noticed me and made that horrible moaning sound that attracted the attention of others. A spotlight swept across my position, illuminating me for the soldiers but also making me visible to every infected person in the area. And from somewhere behind me I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. It was a child's voice calling for help. A living child, not one of the infected. Somewhere in the darkness behind me, a child who was about to be discovered by the infected people who were now heading in my direction. I was 50 yards from safety, from Elena, from the end of this nightmare. But there was a child behind me who was going to die if I didn't do something to help them. That was the moment when I learned what kind of person I really was, when I had to choose between my own safety and a stranger's life, between finding Elena and saving someone else's child. I turned around and ran back into the darkness, toward the infected people and the unknown child, away from the safety I'd spent 2 days trying to reach. Because some choices aren't really choices at all. They're just tests of who you are when everything else is stripped away. The child was hiding behind an overturned car about 100 yards from the military perimeter. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, and she was clutching a stuffed animal while trying not to make any noise. But the infected people had heard her voice and were closing in from multiple directions. I didn't have a weapon except for Frank's pocket knife, and there were at least 15 infected people between me and the child. But I also had something they didn't have. I had experience dealing with them, knowledge of their behavior patterns and the desperate strength that comes from knowing someone else's life depends on your actions. I used the tire iron I'd found in the delivery truck to create noise and distraction, drawing some of the infected people away from the child's position. Then I worked my way around their flank, using cars and debris as cover until I could reach her hiding spot. The little girl's name was Amy, and she'd been separated from her mother during the evacuation of a nearby apartment complex. She'd been hiding behind that car for over 6 hours, too scared to move, watching infected people wander past her hiding spot while she waited for help that hadn't come. Getting Amy to the military checkpoint with 15 infected people in the area required every survival skill I'd developed over the past 2 days. We moved slowly, quietly, using hand signals instead of voices, stopping frequently to let groups of infected people pass by our position. But children don't have the same understanding of danger that adults do, and Amy made mistakes that almost got us both killed. She tripped over debris, making noise that attracted attention. She wanted to go back for her stuffed animal when we had to abandon it. She started crying when we saw an infected person wearing her mother's jacket. We made it to the military perimeter just as the sun was coming up on my 3rd day in hell. The soldiers were initially suspicious, thinking we might be infected, but medical personnel confirmed that we were both healthy and uninjured. Amy was reunited with her father, who'd been searching for her since the evacuation began. Watching them hug each other, seeing the relief and joy on their faces made everything I'd been through seem worthwhile. But Elena wasn't there. The evacuation center at Chase Field was temporary, I learned. Students and staff from Roosevelt Elementary had been processed through the stadium and then transported to more secure facilities outside the Phoenix area. Elena had been evacuated 18 hours earlier, along with her students and the other teachers. I'd made it to Chase Field. I'd survived 2 days in an infected city, saved a child's life, and reached what I thought was safety. But the woman I'd risked everything to find was gone, evacuated to a location that military personnel couldn't or wouldn't tell me about. That's when I realized that my journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. Elena was still out there somewhere, still wondering if I was alive, still waiting for me to find her. But now I had other people counting on me too. The survivors at the grocery store were still trapped, still waiting for someone to help them escape. Amy's reunion with her father reminded me that there were other families being torn apart by this disaster, other people who needed help that only someone with my knowledge of the city could provide. I'd started this journey as a delivery driver looking for his girlfriend. But somewhere along the way, I'd become something else entirely. Someone who couldn't walk away from people in danger. Someone who understood that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about staying human. The military personnel at Chase Field offered to evacuate me along with the other refugees, but I turned them down. I had promises to keep, people to save, and a city to navigate that was becoming more dangerous by the hour. As I prepared to leave the safety of the stadium and head back into infected Phoenix, I thought about Elena and wondered if she would understand the choice I was making. I was walking away from the chance to be evacuated to safety because other people needed my help. But I knew Elena well enough to know that she would make the same choice. She'd always believed that we have a responsibility to help others, especially when we're the only ones who can. That's part of why I loved her, and part of why I knew she'd forgive me for not following her to safety. I left Chase Field as the sun was rising on day 3, armed with better equipment and more knowledge about the infected people's behavior patterns. I had new destinations: the grocery store where my makeshift family was waiting, the other survivor, enclaves I'd seen during my journey, and eventually wherever Elena had been taken. The city was changing around me as I walked back into its infected heart. The creatures that had once been Phoenix residents were becoming more organized, more dangerous, more intelligent. But I was changing too, becoming someone who could navigate this new world and help others survive it. The delivery driver who'd started this journey 48 hours ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and more determined. Someone who understood that in a world where civilization had collapsed, individual acts of courage and compassion were the only things standing between humanity and complete darkness. When I left Chase Field that morning, I was carrying better equipment than I'd had during my journey there. The military personnel had given me a tactical flashlight, a military-grade first aid kit, and most importantly, a 2-way radio tuned to their emergency frequency. They couldn't tell me where Elena had been evacuated to, but they promised to pass along a message if I could reach one of their other checkpoint stations. The walk back toward the grocery store should have taken me 3 hours, but it took almost 8. The city had changed dramatically in the 36 hours since I'd left Tom, Sarah, Miguel, and the others. The infected people were no longer wandering aimlessly through the streets. They were moving with purpose, organizing into larger groups, and most disturbing of all, they were setting up what looked like territories. I first noticed this new behavior when I tried to use the same storm drain system that had helped me escape the day before. The tunnels were occupied now, not by individual infected people, but by groups of them. They'd established some kind of hierarchy, with the older infected ones, the ones who'd been turned for several days, positioned as leaders of sorts. These older infected people retained more of their human intelligence than the newly turned ones. They could still problem solve, still plan, still coordinate group activities, but they'd lost all traces of human empathy or moral reasoning. They were smart enough to set traps, patient enough to wait for prey, and organized enough to work together in ways that made them far more dangerous than the mindless monsters I'd encountered on Tuesday. I had to completely reroute my journey back to the grocery store, avoiding areas that were now controlled by these organized groups of infected people. This meant traveling through parts of Phoenix I'd never navigated before, even with 12 Years of delivery experience. I was in unknown territory, both literally and figuratively. It was during this detour that I encountered something that changed my understanding of what we were really fighting. I was cutting through an industrial area when I heard voices, actual human voices, coming from inside a warehouse. Not the moaning and grunting of infected people, but real conversation between living humans. I approached carefully, using the same stealth techniques I'd developed over the past 3 days. Through a broken window, I could see a group of about 20 survivors who had barricaded themselves inside the warehouse. They had supplies, weapons, and what looked like a functioning radio setup. They'd created exactly the kind of safe haven that the grocery store group needed. But as I watched them, I realized something was wrong. One of the survivors, a woman in her 30s, was tied to a chair in the center of the room. The others were standing around her, arguing about something in hushed tones. I couldn't hear the details of their conversation, but their body language suggested they were making some kind of life or death decision about her. Then I saw the bite mark on her arm. The woman had been bitten, probably recently, and the group was debating what to do about it. I'd seen this situation before with Jenny at the grocery store, but this group seemed to be handling it differently. Instead of the compassionate discussion we'd had about Jenny's situation, this felt more like a trial. I watched for another 10 minutes, trying to decide whether to approach them or continue toward the grocery store. That's when I saw one of the men in the group pull out a pistol and point it at the bitten woman's head. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life. The woman begged for more time, saying she felt fine, that maybe she was immune, that the bite might not be infectious. But the man with the gun wasn't interested in her pleas. He was scared, and fear was making him cruel. The group voted. 20 people deciding whether one person lived or died, and the decision wasn't even close. 18 voted for immediate execution. Only 2 voted to give her more time. I couldn't watch what happened next, but I heard the gunshot from my hiding place outside the warehouse. When I looked again, the woman was dead, and the group was already discussing how to dispose of her body. That incident taught me something important about how different groups of survivors were handling the moral challenges of the outbreak. Some groups, like the one at the grocery store, tried to maintain their humanity even in impossible situations. Other groups were letting fear and desperation turn them into something almost as dangerous as the infected people. I marked the warehouse location on my mental map as a place to avoid. Those survivors might have been human, but they weren't people I wanted to encounter again. The sun was beginning to set by the time I reached the area around the grocery store, and what I saw there made my heart sink. The parking lot was empty. No infected people, no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened to Tom, Sarah, Miguel, and the others. I approached the building carefully, expecting an ambush or a trap. The barricades we'd constructed were still in place, but the back door we'd used as our main entrance was standing open. Inside, the store was empty except for scattered supplies and overturned shopping carts. But there was no blood, no signs of violence, no bodies. The group had left voluntarily, probably taking whatever supplies they could carry. I found a note tucked under a can of soup in the section where we'd been storing our food. It was from Tom, written in his careful police officer handwriting. Roddy, if you're reading this, we made it out alive. The infected people started gathering, in larger numbers outside the store, and we decided to move to a more secure location. We're heading for the school district administration building on Central Avenue. It's got better defenses and multiple escape routes. We'll wait for you there as long as we can. Stay safe. Tom. The note was dated yesterday, which meant they'd moved out less than 24 hours after I'd left for Chase Field. I felt a mixture of relief that they were alive and guilt that my absence had forced them to abandon their safe haven and take bigger risks. The school district administration building was about 5 miles away, but it was in a part of the city that had been heavily affected by the infection. Getting there would require crossing through downtown, Phoenix, where I'd seen the largest concentrations of infected people during my journey to Chase Field. But I had to try. These people had become my family during our time together at the grocery store, and I'd promised to come back for them. Tom had kept the group together and gotten them to safety, but they were still trapped in a hostile city with limited supplies and no way to get to the evacuation centers. I spent that night in the empty grocery store, using it as a base to plan my route to the administration building and to rest, before making another dangerous journey through infected Phoenix. The building felt haunted without the other survivors, filled with memories of conversations and shared fears and moments of hope that seemed like they'd happened years ago, instead of days. During the night, I was awakened by a sound I'd never heard before. It wasn't the usual moaning and shuffling of infected people, but something more organized. It sounded like chanting or maybe singing, but with words I couldn't understand and voices that were definitely not human anymore. I looked out through the barricaded windows and saw something that defied everything I thought I knew about the infected people. There was a group of about 50 of them gathered in the parking lot, and they were standing in formation, not wandering randomly or clustering around food sources, but arranged in neat rows like they were attending some kind of ceremony. At the front of the group was one of the older infected people, one who'd probably been turned during the first day of the outbreak. This individual was making sounds that were almost like speech, and the rest of the group was responding in unison. They were communicating with each other in ways that went far beyond the basic noise-making I'd observed before. The ceremony, or whatever it was, lasted for about an hour. Then the group dispersed, but not randomly. They moved out in organized squads, each squad heading in a different direction like they'd been given specific assignments. I realized that the infected people weren't just becoming smarter. They were developing their own culture, their own social structure, their own methods of communication and organization. They were evolving into something that was no longer human but wasn't mindless either. This development had serious implications for the surviving humans in Phoenix. We weren't just dealing with individual monsters anymore. We were facing an organized enemy that could plan, coordinate, and adapt to our survival strategies. I left the grocery store at dawn, carrying extra supplies I'd scavenged from the abandoned store, and the knowledge that the infected people were becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. The route to the school district building would take me through the heart of downtown Phoenix, but I didn't have a choice. Tom, Sarah, Miguel, and the others were counting on me. The journey started well enough. I used the same stealth techniques that had gotten me to Chase Field, staying in shadows, moving quietly, avoiding areas where I could see or hear infected people. But as I got closer to downtown, I started noticing changes in their behavior that made my old tactics less effective. They were posting sentries now, individual infected people positioned at strategic locations, watching for movement and ready to alert the larger groups. These sentries weren't wandering aimlessly like the infected people I'd encountered earlier. They were standing still, scanning their assigned areas, and responding immediately to anything unusual. I was spotted by one of these sentries when I tried to cross Central Avenue about 2 miles from the administration building. The infected person made a sound I'd never heard before, a high-pitched shriek that was obviously some kind of alarm call. Within minutes, I could hear responding calls from multiple directions as other infected people converged on my position. I ran, but this time was different from my previous chase through the construction zone. The infected people pursuing me were coordinating their movements, cutting off escape routes, herding me toward areas where larger groups were waiting. They'd learned from previous encounters with survivors and developed hunting strategies that were terrifyingly effective. I managed to escape by breaking into an office building and using the stairwells to reach the roof. The infected people could follow me up the stairs, but they had trouble with complex navigation like moving between buildings or climbing down fire escapes. I spent 3 hours on that roof, watching them search the building below while I figured out an alternate route. From the rooftop, I could see the school, district administration building. It was about half a mile away, and it was definitely occupied by survivors. I could see people moving around on the roof, and there were defensive barriers that hadn't been there before. Tom had chosen well. The building was defensible, had multiple escape routes, and was positioned in an area that offered good visibility of approaching threats. But getting there was going to be the most dangerous part of my journey yet. The infected people were actively hunting now, and they'd demonstrated that they could organize complex search patterns. I was going to have to use every trick I'd learned about moving through hostile territory, I waited until late afternoon to make my move, timing my descent from the office building to coincide with a shift change in the infected sentries. They seemed to operate on some kind of schedule, rotating their positions every few hours like a military unit. The final approach to the administration building required me to cross an open area that offered no cover or concealment. It was a calculated risk, betting that I could cover the distance before the infected sentries could organize a response. I made it about halfway before they spotted me. This time, I didn't run away from the building. I ran toward it, gambling that Tom and the others were watching and would be ready to help. It was the right decision. As the infected people closed in on me, I heard gunshots from the administration building roof. Tom and Miguel were covering fire, forcing the infected people to take cover and giving me the time I needed to reach the building's entrance. Sarah was waiting at the door with her medical kit, ready to treat any injuries I might have sustained. Frank and Dorothy were there too, looking older and more tired than they had just 3 days ago, but alive and unharmed. Maria was crying, with relief, and Kevin and Amanda were smiling for the first time since I'd met them. But not everyone had made it to the administration building. James, the construction worker, had been killed during their evacuation from the grocery store. He'd volunteered to act as rear guard while the others escaped, and he'd been overwhelmed by infected people before he could reach safety. The loss of James hit the group hard. He'd been one of our strongest members, someone everyone depended on for his practical skills and steady demeanor. His death was a reminder that even with careful planning and group coordination, survival was never guaranteed. Tom briefed me on what had happened during my absence. The infected people had begun gathering around the grocery store in larger numbers, making it impossible to venture outside for supplies or reconnaissance. The group had voted to relocate to a more defensible position, but the evacuation had been chaotic and dangerous. They'd chosen the school district administration building because it offered better sight lines, multiple escape routes, and a rooftop that could be used for signaling to rescue aircraft. But they'd also discovered something disturbing during their time there. The building's security system was still functional, and its cameras showed that the infected people were gathering in unprecedented numbers in the downtown area. They weren't just wandering around randomly anymore. They were massing for something, organizing into larger groups and moving with a purpose that nobody could figure out. Miguel had been monitoring radio communications, and the reports from other survivor groups were increasingly dire. The military checkpoints around the city were being overwhelmed. The evacuation centers outside Phoenix were running out of space and supplies. And most disturbing of all, there were reports of infected people displaying new abilities that defied everything we thought we knew about the outbreak. Some infected people were apparently retaining more of their human intelligence than others. They could use tools, operate simple machinery, and even communicate with uninfected humans in limited ways. These smart, infected people were leading the others, organizing them into increasingly effective hunting parties and siege units. Sarah had been treating a survivor who'd escaped from another group, and his story was terrifying. His group had been trapped in a shopping mall when the infected people learned to operate the automatic doors. They'd figured out how to turn off the power to the building, then systematically hunted down every survivor inside. But the most disturbing development was something that none of us wanted to talk about openly. The infected people weren't just killing the humans they caught anymore. They were taking some of them alive, dragging them back to central locations, for purposes that nobody understood. The survivors who witnessed these kidnappings reported that the victims were kept alive for several hours before being infected intentionally. This suggested that the infected people were developing some kind of culture or society, with rituals and practices that served purposes beyond simple feeding. They were becoming something new, something that had never existed before, and they were doing it faster than we could adapt to their changes. As night fell on my 4th day in infected Phoenix, I sat on the roof of the administration building with Tom, looking out over a city that was no longer recognizably human. The lights that were still functioning revealed groups of infected people, moving through the streets in organized formations. Fires burned unchecked in areas where they'd apparently decided to clear out human survivors. And in the distance, we could see larger gatherings that looked almost like communities. Tom and I talked about our options. We could try to reach one of the military checkpoints, but those were being overrun with increasing frequency. We could attempt to escape the city entirely, but the highways were blocked and the desert surrounding Phoenix was becoming filled with infected people who'd wandered away from the urban areas. Or we could stay and fight, using our knowledge of the city and our experience with the infected people's behavior to help other survivors escape. It wasn't a realistic long-term strategy, but it might buy time for some people to reach safety while keeping us alive long enough to find out what had happened to Elena. I told Tom about my encounter with the warehouse group, about their casual decision to execute a bitten survivor. He nodded grimly and said he'd seen similar behavior from other survivor groups they'd encountered during their journey to the administration building. Fear makes people do terrible things, he said. We've managed to hold on to our humanity so far, but every day it gets harder. Every decision we make feels like it might be the one that pushes us over the edge. That's when Sarah joined us on the roof and told us something that would change everything. She'd been monitoring medical radio frequencies and she'd picked up a transmission from a research facility outside the city. Scientists were claiming they'd identified the source of the infection and were working on both a cure and a vaccine. But the facility was under siege by infected people, and they were requesting immediate military assistance. The transmission had been broadcast 6 hours ago, and there'd been no follow-up communication since then. The research facility was about 30 miles northeast of Phoenix, in an area that was supposedly less affected by the outbreak. If the scientists were really close to a cure, and if they were still alive, getting to them might be our only hope of ending this nightmare. But 30 miles through infected territory with a group of survivors who weren't trained for combat was essentially a suicide mission. We'd need vehicles, weapons, supplies, and most importantly, a plan that accounted for the infected people's evolving intelligence and organization. As I sat there on that rooftop, looking out over the ruins of the city I'd called home for my entire life, I realized that my personal mission to find Elena was becoming part of something much larger. The outbreak wasn't just a local disaster anymore. It was a fundamental change in what it meant to be human, and the choices we made in the next few days might determine whether humanity survived at all. Elena was still out there somewhere, hopefully safe in one of the evacuation centers. But now I had to consider the possibility that even the evacuation centers might not be safe for much longer. The infected people were evolving, adapting, becoming something that could potentially overrun any defensive position given enough time and numbers. The delivery driver who'd started this journey 4 days ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant preserving the best parts of humanity while fighting against forces that wanted to transform us into something monstrous. Tomorrow, we would have to make a decision about whether to attempt the journey to the research facility. It might be our last chance to find a cure, but it might also be the last decision any of us ever made. As I prepared to get some sleep, before another day of impossible choices, I thought about Elena and wondered if she would recognize the person I was becoming. I was still the same man who loved her, but I was also someone who'd learned to make life and death decisions, someone who'd seen the worst of human nature and fought to preserve the best of it. The city was changing around us, and we were changing with it. The only question was whether we could change fast enough to survive what was coming next. The decision to attempt the journey to the research facility came down to a vote, just like the decision about Jenny at the grocery store had. But this time, the stakes were different. We weren't just deciding whether one person lived or died, we were deciding whether to risk everything on the possibility that someone 30 miles away might have a cure for the infection that was destroying our world. Tom laid out the situation as clearly as he could. The research facility had gone silent 12 hours ago. The route there would take us through territory controlled by increasingly organized groups of infected people. We had limited weapons, no vehicles, and no guarantee that the facility was still operational or that its occupants were still alive. But we also had Sarah's medical expertise, my knowledge of Phoenix's infrastructure, Miguel's mechanical skills, and Tom's tactical experience. More importantly, we had something that the infected people didn't have. We had hope, and the desperate courage that comes from knowing that staying put was just a slower form of death. The vote was closer than I'd expected. Sarah, Miguel, and I voted to make the attempt. Tom was reluctant, but eventually agreed that it was our best option. Frank and Dorothy voted against it, arguing that they were too old to make such a dangerous journey and would slow the group down. Maria voted against it because she didn't want to risk her life when her children might still be alive somewhere and needing her. Kevin and Amanda were the deciding votes, and they chose to come with us. Kevin said he'd rather die trying to do something meaningful than waste away in a defensive position waiting for the inevitable. Amanda said she'd seen too many people give up hope, and she refused to become one of them. Frank and Dorothy made the heartbreaking decision to stay behind at the administration building. They'd found a secure room in the basement where they could wait out the remainder of the outbreak, and they had enough supplies to last several weeks. Frank gave me his father's pocket knife, the same one he'd given me when I left for Chase Field, and told me to give it to Elena when I found her. Dorothy hugged each of us goodbye and made us promise to remember the good times we'd shared, not just the fear and violence. She said that surviving wasn't just about staying alive, but about keeping the memory of who we used to be before the world went insane. Maria decided to stay with Frank and Dorothy, reasoning that 3 people could defend the building more effectively than 2 elderly individuals alone. She gave me a letter for her children, just in case I made it to an evacuation center where they might be located. That left 5 of us to attempt the 30-mile journey to the research facility: Tom, Sarah, Miguel, Kevin, Amanda, and myself. We spent the morning gathering supplies and planning our route, using the building's security cameras to observe infected movement patterns in the surrounding area. Miguel had located a maintenance garage in the building's basement where the school district kept service vehicles. There was a van that was still functional, but it had been sitting unused for months and would need mechanical work before it could make a 30-mile journey. More importantly, we'd have to get it out of the building without attracting the attention of the infected people who'd gathered in the surrounding streets. Sarah inventoried our medical supplies and determined that we had enough first aid materials to treat minor injuries, but nothing that would help if someone got seriously hurt or bitten. She also reminded us that the infection timeline was still roughly 6 hours from bite to full transformation, which meant that anyone who got bitten during the journey would become a threat to the group before we reached our destination. Tom worked on our tactical planning, identifying potential ambush sites along our route and escape strategies if we encountered larger groups of infected people than we could handle. His police experience with riot control and crowd management was invaluable for understanding how the organized infected groups might try to stop us. But I spent most of the morning thinking about Elena and wondering if I was making the right choice. I could have stayed at the administration building with Frank, Dorothy, and Maria. We could have waited for military rescue or tried to signal passing aircraft. There was no guarantee that the journey to the research facility would accomplish anything except getting us all killed. But Elena was still out there somewhere, and if there was really a cure being developed at that facility, finding it might be the only way to ensure her long-term safety. Even if she'd been evacuated to a secure location, those locations would only remain secure as long as the infected people remained relatively disorganized. If they continued to evolve and develop more sophisticated tactics, nowhere would be safe for long. We left the administration building at noon on my 5th day in infected Phoenix, using a service tunnel that connected to the building's parking garage. Miguel had gotten the van running, but it was making concerning noises that suggested it might not survive the entire journey. We loaded it with supplies, weapons, and emergency equipment, then said our final goodbyes to the people who'd chosen to stay behind. The first part of our journey took us through downtown Phoenix, where we encountered the largest concentration of infected people I'd seen since the outbreak began. But their behavior had changed dramatically since my previous trips through the area. Instead of wandering aimlessly or clustering around food sources, they were moving in organized patrols and establishing checkpoint positions at major intersections. We had to abandon our planned route within the first mile, because the streets we'd intended to use were blocked by what could only be described as infected roadblocks. They'd learned to position vehicles and debris to create barriers, then stationed groups of their fighters behind these barriers to ambush anyone trying to pass through. Miguel navigated us through a series of service alleys and loading dock areas that only someone with his mechanical knowledge would have known about. These routes were narrower and more dangerous because they offered fewer escape options, but they were also less likely to be monitored by the infected patrol groups. It was during this detour that we encountered something that changed our understanding of what the infected people were becoming. We were stopped at an intersection, trying to decide which direction to go, when we heard something that sounded almost like music coming from a nearby building. The sound was rhythmic and organized, but it wasn't quite human music. It was more like the chanting I'd heard during the ceremony at the grocery store, but more complex and structured. Through the building's windows, we could see infected people, moving in coordinated patterns almost like they were dancing or performing some kind of ritual. Sarah was fascinated from a medical perspective. "They're developing cultural behaviors," she whispered. "This isn't just infection anymore. They're creating their own society, their own traditions." But Tom was more concerned with the tactical implications. If they're spending time on ceremonies and rituals, they're planning for long-term survival. They're not just trying to spread the infection anymore. They're trying to build something permanent. We watched the ceremony for about 10 minutes, trying to understand what we were seeing. The infected people were organized into groups based on how long they'd been infected. The newer ones, the ones who still looked somewhat human, were positioned on the outside. The older ones, the ones who'd been infected for days and had undergone more dramatic physical changes, were at the center of the ritual. But the most disturbing thing was that they seemed to be teaching the newer infected people. Passing along information, demonstrating behaviors, showing them how to be more effective at hunting and organizing. They were developing a culture of knowledge transfer, just like human societies do. We left that area as quickly and quietly as possible, but the implications of what we'd seen stayed with us for the rest of the journey. The infected people weren't just evolving individually. They were evolving as a society, developing institutions and practices that would make them more dangerous over time. By the time we reached the outskirts of Phoenix, the van was showing serious mechanical problems. Miguel estimated that we had maybe 10 more miles before the engine failed completely. The research facility was still 20 miles away, which meant we were going to have to find another vehicle or complete the journey on foot. But we'd also left the area of highest infected concentration. The suburbs and rural areas outside Phoenix were still dangerous, but the infected people there were less organized and less numerous. We might actually have a chance of reaching the research facility if we could solve our transportation problem. We found our solution at an abandoned gas station about 15 miles outside the city. There was a pickup truck in the service bay that looked like it had been left there for routine maintenance when the outbreak began. Miguel confirmed that it was functional and had enough fuel to complete our journey. But transferring our supplies from the failing van to the pickup truck attracted attention we couldn't afford. A group of infected people had been following us since we left downtown Phoenix, staying far enough back that we couldn't see them clearly, but close enough to track our movement. When we stopped at the gas station, they closed the distance and attacked. This group was different from the mindless monsters I'd encountered on my first day. They coordinated their attack, with some of them trying to surround the building while others attempted to break down the doors. They used tools and weapons they'd picked up along the way, and they communicated with each other using sounds that were almost like a primitive language. Tom and I held them off while Miguel, Sarah, Kevin, and Amanda loaded the pickup truck. The infected people were persistent and intelligent, but they still had the same physical limitations I'd observed before. They could be injured, they could be confused by complex tactics, and they had trouble adapting to unexpected situations, but there were more of them than we'd initially realized. What we'd thought was a group of 6 or 7 infected people turned out to be advanced scouts for a much larger force. As we fought off the initial attack, we could see more infected people, approaching from multiple directions. We made it to the pickup truck just as the larger group arrived at the gas station. Miguel floored the accelerator and we escaped in a cloud of dust and tire smoke, but not before I got a clear look at what was pursuing us. There were at least 30 infected people in the group, and they were organized like a military unit. They had scouts, fighters, and what looked like commanders who were directing the others' movements. Some of them were carrying weapons they'd scavenged from human survivors, and they knew how to use them effectively. But the most disturbing thing was that they didn't give up when we drove away. They continued pursuing us, following the road we'd taken and maintaining a pace that suggested they could track us for hours or even days if necessary. We reached the research facility just as the sun was setting on my 5th day in this nightmare. The facility was larger than I'd expected, a complex of buildings surrounded by high fences and security barriers, but it was also clearly under siege. The infected people had surrounded the entire complex, not in the random clusters I'd seen at other locations, but in organized formations that suggested a coordinated assault. They'd constructed barriers and fortifications of their own, creating what looked like a siege camp around the research facility. Through binoculars, we could see that there were still people alive inside the facility. Lights were on in several buildings, and we could see movement behind reinforced windows. But we could also see that the defensive perimeter was failing. Several sections of the outer fence had been breached, and infected people were making their way into the facility grounds. Tom assessed the situation with his police training and concluded that a direct assault was impossible. There were too many infected people. They were too well organized, and our group was too small to fight our way through their lines. But I had an idea based on my knowledge of delivery and service infrastructure. Research facilities like this one always had multiple entry points for different types of deliveries and services. If I could identify the service entrances and maintenance tunnels, we might be able to infiltrate the facility without having to fight through the main siege lines. Using Miguel's mechanical knowledge and my understanding of building layouts, we identified a maintenance tunnel that connected to the facility's power plant. The tunnel entrance was outside the infected people's siege perimeter, and it would allow us to reach the facility without being detected. The infiltration plan required splitting up the group, which nobody wanted to do. Tom and I would enter through the maintenance tunnel and try to establish contact with the facility's occupants. Sarah, Miguel, Kevin, and Amanda would remain with the pickup truck at a safe distance, ready to provide support or evacuation if the plan failed. But before we could implement the plan, we received a radio transmission that changed everything. It was Elena's voice coming through the emergency frequency the military had given me at Chase Field. She was alive, and she was inside the research facility. Elena had been evacuated from Chase Field to a temporary facility outside Phoenix, but when that location was overrun by infected people, she and a group of other survivors had been transported to the research complex. She'd been there for 2 days, helping the scientists organize their data while they worked on developing a cure. But the facility was running out of time. The infected people's siege tactics were becoming more sophisticated, and the defensive perimeter was collapsing faster than anyone had expected. The scientists estimated they had maybe 12 hours before the facility was completely overrun. However, they'd made a breakthrough. They'd identified the source of the infection and developed what they believed was an effective vaccine. They had enough vaccine doses to treat about 50 people, but they needed to get the vaccine to a production facility where it could be mass-produced. The catch was that the production facility was back in Phoenix, in an area that was now completely controlled by infected people. Getting the vaccine there would require fighting through the same organized infected forces we'd been running for the past 5 days. Elena told me that the scientists were preparing to destroy their research rather than let it fall into the hands of the infected people. Some of the older infected individuals had demonstrated the ability to understand and manipulate basic scientific equipment, and the researchers were afraid that the infection might be able to use their work to become even more dangerous. That's when I realized what we were really facing. This wasn't just a zombie outbreak like the ones in movies and TV shows. The infected people were becoming a new form of intelligent life, one that could potentially inherit human knowledge and technology while discarding human morality and compassion. If they got access to the research facility's equipment and data, they might be able to accelerate their own evolution or develop new ways to spread the infection. The vaccine might be humanity's last chance, but only if we could get it to safety before the facility fell. I told Elena about our group's location and our plan to infiltrate the facility through the maintenance tunnel. She confirmed that the tunnel system was still secure, and provided me with access codes that would get us through the facility's internal security systems. But she also told me something that made my blood run cold. The infected people weren't just trying to overrun the facility, they were trying to capture the scientists alive. They seemed to understand that the researchers possessed valuable knowledge, and they wanted to extract that knowledge for their own purposes. Elena said that several infected individuals had attempted to communicate with the facility's occupants, using broken speech and gestures that suggested they retained more human intelligence than anyone had realized. They weren't just mindless predators anymore. They were becoming something that could think, plan, and learn from human civilization. As I prepared to enter the maintenance tunnel and attempt to reach Elena, I thought about how much had changed since I'd knocked on Mrs. Martinez's door 4 days ago. I'd started this journey as a delivery driver looking for his girlfriend in what I thought was a temporary emergency. Now, I was about to infiltrate a besieged research facility to help extract a vaccine that might be humanity's last hope for survival, while fighting against an evolving enemy that was becoming more dangerous with every passing hour. Elena was alive, and she was less than a mile away from me. But reaching her meant risking not just my own life, but the lives of the people who'd become my family during this nightmare. Tom, Sarah, Miguel, Kevin, and Amanda had trusted me to lead them to safety, and now I was asking them to risk everything on a plan that might not work. But we didn't have a choice. The infected people were evolving faster than we could adapt to their changes. If we didn't get the vaccine out of the research facility and into production, there might not be any human civilization left to save. As Tom and I entered the maintenance tunnel, leaving the others with the pickup truck and emergency instructions, I realized that this might be the last decision I ever made. But it was also the most important one. Elena was waiting somewhere in the darkness ahead, and with her was the possibility of ending this nightmare and returning to a world where people could live without fear of being torn apart by their former neighbors and friends. The tunnel was dark, narrow, and filled with the sounds of machinery that was still functioning despite everything that had happened above ground. As we moved deeper into the facility's infrastructure, I could hear the sounds of the siege echoing through the ventilation systems, but I could also hear something else. Human voices, real human voices, having real conversations about complex scientific problems. People who were still fighting, still working, still hoping that they could find a solution to the horror that had consumed our world. Elena was somewhere in that complex, probably scared and wondering if I was still alive. But she was also working, to save not just herself and me, but everyone who was still human. In a few hours, I would either be holding her in my arms again, or we would both be dead. But either way, we would face whatever came next together, the way we'd always promised. Each other we would. The delivery driver who'd started this journey was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love wasn't just about being together, but about fighting for the possibility that tomorrow could be better than today. And tomorrow, if we survived, we would find out whether humanity had a future, or whether we were just the last generation of a species that was about to be replaced by something else entirely.